Welcome to the Startup Grind.
You're not Swiss.
Right. So I'm just thinking how fun this is, because usually I do presentations, and here I have no idea what this is going to be like. So I'll discover as we go along. So yeah, I'm South African.
Okay.
I grew up in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Seventh generation South African. So my ancestry was German, from northern Germany, missionaries that went out to Africa in the 1850s.
Okay. What part of South Africa?
Northern Natal. It's now known as KwaZulu-Natal.
Okay. Yeah.
So about halfway between Durban and Johannesburg.
All right. Cool. And as a child, did you already feel entrepreneurial? Did you already feel like you had to do something different, or were you selling gadgets to your classmates, or when did you start to think that there's something different?
Well, it didn't really feel like it was different. I grew up on a farm. We had a number of different farms, and entrepreneurialism was just what you did.
Right.
And most of our community were farmers as well. So this is what just everybody did. So when you got home from school in the afternoon, you would help and work in the fields and harvest potatoes. And by the time I was 8 years old, I was driving the tractor on the farm. And by the time I was 12, I was starting to drive the truck. And because I was tall, it looked like I was old enough to drive, and I would drive without a license to deliver things in town. And yeah, so we started doing this very early on.
Okay.
And my sisters, the same thing. They would help my mom prepare things that could be sold in town. Yeah.
And as a child, did you think that you'd grow up to inherit the farm, that you would be a farmer all your life, or were you thinking more business-minded, or did you want to be an astronaut or something completely a different scope?
Neither of those. More like the totally different scope. So
you were already thinking cryptocurrency back then with your potatoes.
Oh yeah. Farming is a really difficult business. You know, they say the best way to become a millionaire with farming is to start with 10 million, and then you lose most of it. It's very difficult, and especially in South Africa where the weather is so unpredictable. There's droughts and floods and hail and so on. It's very difficult work. And my dad had a big struggle doing this, and so I'd never had the intention of becoming a farmer. Regarding business, that's an interesting one. I've always been interested in everything. When I walked into a bookstore, I would always find just about everything interesting. But the one shelf that didn't really grab me was business. So that's an interesting one. And I actually, from a young age, wanted to become an inventor. And from the time I was 2 years old, I enjoyed solving problems on the farm and various other places. And that's really still what I enjoy most, is solving problems. The way that I got into business was actually in a roundabout way, by being interested in helping to do something that would help society work better. And then ultimately I realized that technology is a good way to do that. If you contribute to certain kind of technologies, they help society advance. Yeah, okay. So it was a long way. I started off actually in science, being a researcher.
Okay. Yeah. And at what age did you start your first business?
I worked on the farm, and so we did business that way, as I mentioned. But the time that I started my first business was in the late 90s. I started doing business consulting. I mean, odd jobs, of course, when you're a kid and so on. But the first serious business was my late 90s, and that was consulting. And I did that for about 15 years, which I enjoyed thoroughly.
Okay.
I helped startups with all kinds of things that they needed.
Okay. And then at some point in time, you had the idea for your most recent venture, which is Monetas.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, I can go back a little bit. What drove me from the time I was very young, the town that I was born in is called Vryheid. It's an Afrikaans word which means freedom. So it's one of the Boer republics, the Afrikaner republics from 200 years ago, and or longer than that, actually. And so we grew up as free spirits in South Africa, and so there's been this, from the earliest days, from the 1600s, 1700s, the population in South Africa revolted against the government. Kind of similar to the United States, where you had the American Revolution against the British occupation. So this kind of free spirit was a driving force always. And so with the apartheid environment and the injustices and so on that happened there, and the very authoritarian society that we had in South Africa and the community that I grew up in, really fired up that desire to help free things up. And so I was involved in a number of projects starting in my teenage years. And just before I started Monetas, I was involved in a project in Honduras to build a free city. And because basically, just before I got involved in that project, I kind of thought to myself, I've been passionate about helping to do something that would help society be freer. But I always did it part-time and worked on ideas and so on, and never made it my full-time occupation. And I thought the idea was always make money and then take that money and start up something that would help things be free. And at a certain point I realized, just go and do it. Just do it. And just jump and not worry about the risks and so on. And I made that commitment in, I think it was 2010, sometime in 2010. And the commitment I made was I would now do everything I can to move in this direction, even if I never earn any money with it. And even if I keep failing at it, I have to make a total irreversible commitment to it. And so the first significant project that came out of that was this Honduras project.
Okay.
So I worked with a small team of people on a free city, a so-called free city. Now, at that time, that was still quite a radical idea. Now, there's a lot of these projects that are going on in different parts of the world. So we worked like crazy for nearly 6 months, like crazy. And then at the end of it, we were blocked by the Supreme Court in Honduras that said, no, there's some technicality of why this is not legal in Honduras. So the project shut down at the beginning of 2012, end of 2011, beginning 2012. So that was quite disappointing, very tough to take when you've invested in so much and really worked yourself to the point of burnout. But I said to myself, well, this commitment was not conditional. I've made a commitment to keep going with this, no matter how difficult it is. And so I thought, well, how next? I don't want to invest this much energy and then it's going to be stopped again by, like a Supreme Court or something. So then I thought, well, I did some brainstorming with friends, and what came out of that for me was that technology is probably a better way to go.
Right.
Instead of trying to change the political system or start a new country, build a technology that a lot of people enjoy using with no ideological requirement.
Okay.
Like the iPhone changed the world and social media changed the world, and the combination of mobile phones and social media led to the Arab Spring Revolution in North Africa. So, and if you go back through history, the invention of fire, gunpowder, sailing ships, printing press, the internet, and so on, they've all made huge differences to how the world works. I mean, the internal combustion engine led to the rise of the Middle East because they had oil. So politics really tends to be more of a consequence of technology. So then the question was, what kind of technology could one work on that would have this kind of positive impact? So in the brainstorming, I thought, well, the financial center is the core of everything. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what the country is, everything runs across the financial system. The whole economy runs via the financial system. And the financial system now is very centralized. And that has a lot of risks and problems. It's got risks of political abuse or abuse of power, we being human beings. But even if you had perfect angels running it, in terms of moral angels, you still have the possibility of catastrophic failure. You know, if a comet, if there's a sunburst, like an electromagnetic pulse, and it wipes out a centralized system, then everybody suffers. Or if there's a computer bug and it's a centralized system, it wipes out and everybody suffers.
Right.
So we have to decentralize things to make a more resilient financial system and world.
That's where the idea for the wallet came from.
Yeah, and so that was January 2012. And in 2011, I'd heard about Bitcoin, but I didn't have time to really look into it until the beginning of 2012. So then we started brainstorming, and after a few months decided to start Monetas. Yeah. So that was in Vancouver, Canada.
Okay. So you started off in Canada, and what led to the idea of moving it to Switzerland?
Well, the key thing is that, I've always been an ecosystem thinker. That's how I really started this whole journey when I was a teenager. Always been thinking about countries and constitutions and the environment that you operate in and so on. I mean, one of the most dramatic examples is if you cross the border from Mexico into the United States, the same person, nothing's changed. They just crossed a line and suddenly they earn much more. And their life changes, less crime and all of this. The same when you went from East Germany to West Germany, or from North Korea to South Korea, or from China into Hong Kong. So it's the system that you're in that has a very powerful effect on your life and what you can do. And the same thing for building a company. Ecosystems are really powerful. And the obvious ecosystem to go to is Silicon Valley, of course. Everyone talks about Silicon Valley, and you've got the capital, the talent, the service providers, and the whole environment, the legal framework, and so on. The problem was that back in 2012, this is now 6 years ago, there was enormous resistance, not just resistance, but aggressive opposition to all these, to Bitcoin and other crypto technologies. If you as much as mentioned the word Bitcoin, people were like, whoa, this guy's a terrorist or a criminal or a child pornographer or something. So it was a very risky environment, and the United States was not the right environment. So Silicon Valley was really not an option. So I looked around a little bit and looked at different possibilities from South America, countries like Chile. Singapore, of course, is always up there. But then I eventually decided Switzerland is the best place, because if we're going to do things to decentralize the financial system, you need an environment that is friendly to decentralization. And virtually no country in the world is friendly to decentralization. They're all about centralizing power. In fact, even in Switzerland, politicians like to centralize power. But the Swiss system makes it very difficult for them to do that, because the people are in control. And it's the most decentralized country in the world. And the whole culture here, for going back 7 centuries, is decentralization. So if there's one place in the world that you want to do something to decentralize things, it's here. Because you've got moral support from the people. And there's a whole number of reasons, but that's definitely the key reason.
Okay. And with the way things are changing right now with in fintech and with FINMA and the different regulations, how do you see that? Do you see it from a banking perspective, them trying to regain control, or is it because they want a piece of the pie, or is there a different reason? How do you see the advancements in regulation?
Yeah. Well, we are very, very lucky here in Switzerland. I started working with the regulators in 2014, and we've gone through a process of education over the past 4 years. And I would say, with one exception, Switzerland has the regulatory system, the regulators that are most friendly to crypto in the world. And they are not just friendly, but educated about it. So it's been a lot of hard work the past 4 years. It's still ongoing. But we've really succeeded in, number one, showing them that this technology offers fantastic opportunities to Switzerland. The way I sold it back in 2013, I came up with the concept of Crypto Valley in May 2013 when I was still in Vancouver. and I presented it to the Swiss Economic Promotion Agency called Switzerland Global Enterprise. And the way I sold it was Switzerland has built its success on the old financial system, the old financial center.
Right.
But that's increasingly under threat, and the money is leaving Switzerland and going to Singapore and Asia in massive amounts. And it's no secret that this was a worrying trend. And I said, well, here's an opportunity to change it around. Just like with watches, the Swiss watch industry in the 1970s, we had the threat from Asia, digital watches coming, and then Swatch found a way to turn around and reinvent the Swiss watch industry. And I said, this is what we need to do for the Swiss financial system so that it becomes the financial center of the future. And a new success story for Switzerland. And they liked that idea. And so I came here in July 2013 and started building it up.
Okay.
And so the regulators here are very well informed. In fact, I'll give you one example. This was about 18 months ago. We were sitting in another working group with them. And at that point, a lot of them are very young people. When I say young, under 40. They are digital natives. In other words, they walk around with digital devices and technologies and software and so on. And they like how that works. And they don't like things being old-fashioned either. So when we spoke to them, it was, like preaching to the choir. And at a certain point, we had gotten enough of the principles across that we were pushing further. And at that point, they said, we are already giving you everything you want. In fact, we are already bending the rules within the limits of us not landing in prison. So now, if you want to go further, you've got to go to the government itself for Parliament to change the laws, because the regulator cannot change the laws. But they would also like the law changed. Now imagine that. Like, where in the world do you get a regulator who says, we're bending over backwards to help you, but please help us to make the law so we can help you even more. So that's really a fantastic situation here, and there's no risk of that changing. Switzerland is 110% behind crypto. They've seen, in the beginning they were a little skeptical, but they've seen the value that we've brought here. Tens of billions of dollars in value creation here in Switzerland. It's a huge success story, and they definitely don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. In fact, just about a couple of weeks ago, we had a conference in St. Moritz, and Johann Schneider-Ammann, who's from the top government, was. I don't know how many people here know this. Switzerland does not have something like a president, like other countries do. They have 7 people who share the presidency, essentially. But because other countries don't know how to deal with that, they'll kind of just appoint one of those to have the title of president for a year, and then they rotate it again the next year. So Johann Schneider-Ammann is one of those 7. And so we, at the conference a couple of weeks ago, he said that, he talked about various things around crypto, and he said he hopes that in 5 years from now, we no longer talk about Crypto Valley, but about Crypto Nation Switzerland. And that's a stunning thing. So really, from the top government to the regulators to local government, Switzerland is behind this. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just do what we want. You need good regulations in place. And certainly the regulators keep on asking, what's a good way to regulate it so you have all the benefits, but without too many of the costs. You can never get the costs down to 0, but to have a good balance.
I think we could talk about this for another hour. There's so much, and you're definitely a huge source. But just to back up a little bit, the Crypto Valley concept, so there's 2 questions. When you're talking about, especially in a group of entrepreneurs, team versus solo founder. So one question is about the Crypto Valley. Do you have a group of colleagues or a group of people behind that? And the same question, I guess, that we'd like to move on a little bit to talk about Monetas, which was your primary, as far as I understand, your primary company for the last couple of years, as far as the founding that company and the team behind it. And so first, Crypto Valley, how did it start? Yeah.
Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned a little bit ago, I realized that for Monetas to be successful, we needed the right environment. Like for a seed to thrive, you need good soil. And so I decided to do that here. And if there's no ecosystem, then build it.
Right.
And so I started in July 2013 marketing to various people. I said, look, we've come here. And I wrote a long document and said, here's all the reasons why you should come here as well. And it took about 6 months for the first success story. That was Ethereum in January 2014. I heard that Ethereum was scouting around for locations like Amsterdam, Toronto, etc. And I persuaded some of them to come to Zug to have a look at Zug. And we persuaded them to set up there. So Ethereum is based in Zug. And so, you know, that thing of it's not the first mover, it's the first follower that's really important. So Ethereum was the first follower, and that had a huge impact.
Right.
And then a few weeks after they came here, in February 2014, I chose the name Crypto Valley. Because I kept talking about, you know, we need to do like Silicon Valley, but for crypto. And at a certain point, it was like Crypto Valley.
Just made sense, yeah.
And then started marketing that at conferences and so on. So with Ethereum having come, that really made it a lot easier to attract additional people. So we got Zappo and Shapeshift and most recently Tezos and so on. And so that's been an amazing journey. And of course, it's never possible to do anything alone. It's always a team effort. And in this case, for Crypto Valley to be successful, first we needed the environment of Switzerland. We needed friendly local authorities like in Zug. That's the reason I chose Zug and not another canton. They are particularly friendly to business, and we established good relationships with them starting in July 2013. So they were supportive, initially skeptical, but cautiously open to the idea. And gradually they've become very much enthusiastic and very supportive. It needed entrepreneurs like Ethereum, Zappo, and many others, and people who organize meetups and, you know, and we needed to change the regulations. So I set up an organization in 2014 to work with the regulators. That's been a big success story. We changed regulations to make it more attractive. And not just for in general, but in the case of Zappo, they struggled to set up here and for almost a year, and eventually decided they're going to leave. And I got this email from Wences Casares in the middle of 2016 where he said, I'm leaving Switzerland. And I said, whoa, that would be terrible. You know, let's figure out a way. And so we put together a working group of lawyers and local authorities, and we worked with the regulators. And eventually we figured out a way to do it, and they changed things to make it possible for Zappo to stay. Talk about 2 months. So anyway, it's a lot of people working together, and we trained up a legal firm, MME, based in Zug, and where they've become the leading firm in the field, and marketed them to the world and said, if you want help, go to them. So it was an education process, changing laws, having support from local government officials, people taking the jump from startups and coming. So a lot of people working together, setting up meetups, and then most recently setting up the Crypto Valley Association, which has done fantastic work. They've got, I think, about 600 members now, not just from Switzerland, but from all over. So it's really a combination of many, many different things. A lot of people doing a lot of work together.
Okay.
But of course, like all projects, it doesn't work if there's nobody who's got the idea and the vision and the strategy and drives it forward to help coordinate everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And then with Monetas, so that was more, Crypto Valley is an association, it's an ideology, it's a framework, it's a bunch of things it's an enablement. Monetas was an actual business, an actual company.
Yes.
And you had a team there. Were you a single founder there, or?
No, 2 founders.
Okay.
So just another thought, one of the early guys in Crypto Valley was Niklas Nikolaisen from Bitcoin Suisse. He actually arrived right after I got there. I got there in July, and he came in August. So he got there independently. And so we've been kind of driving things forward together and done a lot of things with the regulators together. And Bitcoin Suisse also went through very difficult times, struggled, was almost ready to throw in the towel. And but we supported each other, and now it's a big success story, really big success story. Same with Ethereum. They were at the end of end of 2016? I sometimes forget which year it is, but December 2016, they were down and out, couldn't pay their bills. And literally a few weeks later, started the turnaround, and they're shooting, and of course now a huge success story. Very typical in startups. So with Monetas, same thing. We've gone through huge challenges. In fact, anyone who reads the news would have seen that in December it was announced that Monetas is bankrupt. Well, I'm happy to announce, for those who haven't read the recent news, that we are no longer bankrupt.
Wow.
So, thank you. It's that old thing, like I've spoken to a few of you here tonight that are entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs. The valley of death is that notorious thing that a lot of startups go through, unless you've got a really rich uncle. You start off with an idea, and initially you attract a little bit of funding from family and friends, and it's enough to start getting things going, and you start developing, a minimum viable product or a mock-up or something, and then you get super excited and you build the team, and the expenses grow, but you haven't got revenues yet, and then you go through the valley of death, and a lot of startups never get out of that, and they die. So we certainly had that same challenge, and it's quite interesting. In the early days, when there's still enough money to pay everyone, and you go with a vision, everyone's excited, you're all together, you go for beers after work, and it's a fantastic spirit. But then, as the money runs out, and especially here in Switzerland, different than Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, it's kind of, people know chances of failing are like 95%. And they don't take that as a problem. In fact, there's a lot of companies and VCs in Silicon Valley, when you come to them and you want a job or you want money, they'll say, well, tell us about yourself. What are some of your failures? And if you have not had a failure, they're like, well, go out and make some mistakes and then come back. Because you learn through the failure. Switzerland is a very different environment. And as much as I love Switzerland, this is one of the downsides of Switzerland. It's a perfectionistic culture. If you make a mistake here, it's like, whoa, you're ostracized. Don't do business with that person. In fact, don't invite them to your parties. They're a loser. It's very difficult, which is why young people in Switzerland generally don't like to work for startups. They like to work for UBS and other big companies like Nestle or Novartis or Google. So, this is what surveys show. This is something that needs to change in Switzerland. People need to become more risk-friendly, more willing to start up and fail, and say, well, I learned something from the failure. So anyway, getting back to Monetas. So then when things get difficult and you can't pay bills, then people get sour. And that makes it very difficult, because then you're not just fighting to try and get money in, which is always a big challenge. You also have to deal with problems inside the team in your company. So very, very difficult times, I have to say. Much more difficult than anyone would imagine. Even if you think you know what it's going to be like, it's 100 times more difficult. But we made it through. We've got very strong funding from Wall Street, United States. So funding is no longer an issue, not just for the next few days or weeks or months. We've got funding handled. So that's a really fantastic thing. And we're building a very powerful international team. So the Monetas vision is going to be realized, which I'm very happy about. So it's one of those things of just not giving up ever, ever, ever.
It's not every day that you get to hear the turnaround and the outcome, and as it's basically in real life happening. Like you said, it's just happening now. I mean, there's been a lot in the news about the negative and the failure, but like you said, they don't seem to be as excited about the turnaround. Once a failure, always a failure. But it's fantastic to hear that, and it's so true. I think other people who have experienced that will also resonate with that. The fact that you can't give up. You have to keep pushing ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really not that different in life in general. I mean, it's true for all of life, whether you're in a relationship or a job or trying to get fitter in the gym or whatever it is. There's always difficulty to struggle with, and you fail. We all fail every single day. But it's when you do a startup, it's like it's more concentrated. It's like a very intense version of life. Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions, throughout the course of the next part, we'll welcome some questions. Those of you who are aware of what's happening with Monetas and with Tezos, there are some legal restrictions, so it's possible that your answer might not be, your question might not be answered. But really the idea is to learn about the entrepreneurial experience, what can you learn from the startup perspective, and not to ask about the current legal situation that's happening. So if you have something that you want to learn from, that you think that's relevant, then we want to hear it.
So how do you justify telling someone here the cost of living is quite high, the salaries are ridiculously high in many companies? And how do you convince them to work in a startup where the failure rate, as you just mentioned, is upwards of 90%? Do you convince them to join it and work here in Switzerland?
Well, that's a sales job, really. You have to persuade people through vision. I mean, there's that famous anecdote of Steve Jobs who went to who was that guy who worked at Coca-Cola, and Steve Jobs went to this guy. So this guy had a super job at Coca-Cola, high top executive, and then he went. Was it Pepsi? Oh yeah, Scully, that's right. And he said to him, "Well, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your day, or for the rest of your days, or do you want to do something important?" I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And money, of course, is important. We need to be able to pay the bills. So you have to have money. But it's not the thing that people get excited about. Well, with some exceptions. There's certainly people who are driven by money as their number one thing. But I think most people want to have the feeling that they're doing something that has additional meaning beyond money. And if you can plug into that and show them that if they join the project, they're going to really have the opportunity to do something important in the world, really important, that will help a lot of people. I think that's the key.
And one more thing, the other question would be conversely, as a company, how do you justify working in Switzerland? Why not take your idea to Poland or, I don't know, Singapore?
That's a great question. And in fact, I got a key to the answer right here in Google. More than 4 years ago, one of the companies I came to in July 2013 was Google, right here. And I spoke to the head of engineering hiring, and I asked him about the cost of salaries and so on. And he said to me, well, Google is hiring more people, or they're building out more here in Zurich than anywhere else, except Mountain View. And even though the cost is high, because the innovation and the productivity here is even higher than what the cost is higher. In other words, the return per dollar, the innovation per dollar, and the productivity per dollar is better here than just about everywhere else in the world. So the Swiss work ethic, the fact that you can trust each other and you work well together, the high standard of the education system here when you come from ETH and other good educational institutions, and you just get the job done right the first time. Whereas if you go, and I don't want to mention any names because these days it's so politically correct, you can't say anything and you get blasted for it. But let's just say some other country where it's a lot cheaper, like 10 times cheaper. But then there's a lot of mistakes. And then you've got to pay somebody in Switzerland to go and check that person's work so that you catch the mistakes. Or they're just not that innovative. You need to pay somebody in Switzerland to do the innovation and then tell them what to do. So I'm exaggerating, of course. It's not that simple, but that's the basics of it. So not to just look like an accountant at dollars per hour, but what do you get for it? What's the return on investment? And I think that's why Google keeps spending a lot here in Switzerland and Zurich.
Hi, thank you for coming here, first of all. My question is in terms of the crypto valley, if that's also a fine topic. I mean, we're a bunch of little kids, little startup, just here trying to make something happen, right? Mostly in the financial sector, Zappo, Smart Valor, those guys, they're trying to compete with the big brothers, with the UBSs and all the other intermediaries, and trying to do the changes in the regulation, right? So my question is in terms of how are the chances? Like here is better than other places, but how do you see the chances of those little guys getting banking license, doing actual change in the regulation, and what's the pace? When is this gonna come such that they can actually be operative?
The chances are excellent. We've actually changed laws here in Switzerland. So this is not speculation, this is the reality. We've actually changed laws in Switzerland. And there's a whole bunch of working groups that are working on this now, where there's people from startups there and people from the legal firms that we've trained up in this. And we are keeping on pushing the envelope. I met with another one of those top 7 group, Uli Maurer, at our offices in last August, a few months ago. And at a certain point in the conversation, he just said, so this was one of the things. Part of how you solve stuff is create a feeling of competition. And I said to him, one of the governments I consult to is X. I can't say who it is, unfortunately, openly here. But and I said, those guys are totally open to these proposals for regulation. In fact, they've taken virtually everything that I've proposed to them and are implementing it in their law. And it's a country that Switzerland feels very competitive with. And he just about the next moment, almost the next sentence is like, well, if they can do it, we can do it. So let's set up a blockchain task force. And literally that task force is set up and it's now working, and they had their first meeting in January. So it's a sales job and getting a lot of people together and showing them that it works. In the beginning, that was very tough to do, but now so much money has come here, and investment and talent and so on, that they now see this is the goose that lays the golden eggs. Let's help it. So to answer your question, it's not just possible, we are doing it. But we need more support from startups, because the one risk that I see is that, as very often happens, the big guys come in and they start killing it. We had a meeting in December that had a whole bunch of people. I was there from a startup, but I was just about the only guy from a startup. There were maybe 2 or 3 others, and most of them were from the big insurance companies and the big banks and so on. And you could just hear it. Everything that they asked was an indirect way of protectionism. And that is the danger. And I don't want to mention specific names either here, but that's something we have to watch for in the organizations that are in Crypto Valley and in Switzerland, that they don't get taken over by the big companies. We need the big companies. I've been saying for a long time, we need both. It shouldn't be a war between them. Startups are good at innovation, but they're not good at scaling. Big companies are good at scaling, and they have the resources. So it's a good partnership. Support the startups to bring the ideas, and then help them grow up and be big and have a lot of impact. But if the big companies start feeling threatened by startups, or startups feeling threatened by big companies, it's not good. So we need to partner and work together.
Thank you.
So a little bit back to the cryptocurrency topic. You recently were part of a successful ICO that turned out to be a bit of a mess. What can you tell us about that?
So that gets back to legal constraints. Because we've got a whole bunch of lawsuits going on at the moment, unfortunately, I can't really say very much about it. I'd love to chat more, but the lawyers go crazy if you say anything. So,
or perhaps from a startup perspective, what can you share with us as far as working with people?
I can talk in generalities, and hopefully that's not frustrating for you. But one thing I can say is that early on, things worked really well.
So how many people are familiar with Tezos and what's happening with Tezos? Okay, so there's already a basic framework for that.
Okay, so maybe for those that do not know what Tezos is, it's a blockchain. So we've had Bitcoin as the first major blockchain, and then Ethereum as the second major generation of blockchain, and Tezos is a third major generation of blockchains. And I helped from early on for Tezos to come here to Switzerland. In fact, I wrote an email to Arthur Breitman back in 2014 when I noticed that he was interested in crypto and this kind of stuff. And I said, we need smart people here in Crypto Valley. Please come to Crypto Valley. But it took another 2 years to persuade him to actually come here. He called me actually in February 2016. And I can't say very much about that conversation either, unfortunately. But long story short, I persuaded and invited him to Switzerland in August 2016 and arranged meetups. And within 2 weeks of coming to Crypto Valley, he had more money than he needed to fund his development. Introduced him to the network of funders and so on. And early on, things went really well. We got a lot of things done very quickly and very easily. And that's because there was trust. And then there was a breakdown of trust. And I'm not going to say why or anything, but there was a breakdown of trust, and then things became impossible. And this is something we see everywhere in the world. I mean, when you're in love with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, in the beginning, everything's just awesome and easy. And once that trust isn't there, it becomes impossible, and there's war and so on. And in society as well, we know that high-trust societies are much wealthier than low-trust societies. A lot of studies done on this. So the key thing you want to do is, how do you have an environment of trust? That's what you need to look at. In fact, Google has done studies on this. They found that they used to, in the early days, have this philosophy of hiring people that are superstars. You know, the brilliant lone genius. And they found that actually isn't really where the big value is created. You need those people, of course, but overall, the biggest value is created in teams that have high trust. And maybe none of those guys is a superstar. You need bright people, of course, but if you have a team that has high trust with psychological safety, you just have amazing performance. And if you don't have that trust, you can have all the geniuses in the world and it will not go anywhere. So the interpersonal aspect is extremely important. And in fact, I saw a quote from Elon Musk where he said, I think about a couple of years ago, he said that his biggest mistake, now this is interesting. Here's a guy who's done lots of different businesses. He's had failures and was kicked out of one company and started another and so on. And he said his biggest mistake was to not pay more attention to kindness. He used to hire just the most talented people he can find. And he found that that's not the best recipe. You've got to look at, is this a good person? Are they kind? What are their relationships going to be like? Because if that doesn't work, all the talent in the world is not going to get you anywhere. So that's definitely what we've experienced at Tezos, is that there was a breakdown of trust. And it's been a very, very painfully difficult process. It really started in August. It kind of became more public in October, but it started in August. So we've lost about 6 months because of this. But over these months, we've gradually, very painfully, succeeded in rebuilding trust. It's not where it needs to be. We're still quite a ways away from that. But as we've succeeded in rebuilding the trust, it became possible to start doing things again. It was kind of late December, that things got to the point where it started to be possible to get a few things done. I mean, even simple things like where to hold a meeting. It's amazing. You can't even get agreement on where to hold a meeting. And then in January, it started taking another step forward. And now we are quite confident that this will be resolved in a good way. There's no guarantees, don't have a crystal ball, it could still fail. But I'm confident. that it will be a success. We've got very specific solutions that we've worked out on how to resolve a number of different issues. And I cannot talk about those, unfortunately, but this will see the people who contributed to the project be happy, and it will, you can't say it will, but it's got a good chance of resolving the lawsuits in the United States and so on. So we've got very concrete, specific things we're doing, and we've succeeded in attracting the first person into the board. For those of you who know the background, we didn't have a complete board. Now we have a complete board, and it's a very competent guy. He just started with us a week ago, and already it's really helpful. He's making an impact, and you're going to see things improve much more quickly going forward. There's additional people that are now willing to join. When you've got a controversial thing like this, it's difficult to attract good people, because if you've got a track record and a reputation, then you don't want to lose it. But those are the people that you want to join. And they're like, no, sort your stuff out first. But you need those guys to sort your stuff out. So it's like a catch-22. But now we got the first guy last week. And there's a few others that are really great people, good track records, widely respected, that we hope will be joining as well soon. So we expand the board, make it more independent, and competent people that are very deeply experienced and very successful in business. So that's as much as I can say, that it's looking good, but it's going to take some more work.
And through these challenges, like you mentioned before, this valley of death with not just one, but basically two simultaneous valley of death, with Monetas, the struggles, and with Tezos, the struggle there, I'm sure it had a strong emotional, physical, and mental strain on you. What are your suggestions to be able to make it through these challenging days as an entrepreneur, as a founder?
Well, do you know that sickness when you age quickly? Well, that's what happens when you do this. There's actually a quote. I love quotes. It's just a personal thing. There's a wonderful quote that captures that quite well. It's actually from Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. He says, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." So the key thing is that you have to have a why that drives you. It's that thing that I mentioned about my commitment from years ago when I said, no matter what, no matter how tough it is, I'll just keep going. That's the why that drives you. If you don't have that, forget it. You could be the most talented person in the world. You could have all the money in the world. You could have everything. You will not get there. And there's a lot of people that don't have the talent, that don't have the money, they've got a lot of things holding them back, but because they are driven by a why that they will just not stop. They don't have a guarantee either, but then they've got a decent chance. And that's the key, that you get up again. You fall off the horse and you get back up. You fall off the horse and you get back every day again. That's the only thing I can say. Oh, maybe one thing. It does help to do things like have a strong spiritual practice. If you take things personally, forget it. You'll die very quickly, because the further up you move, the worse the criticism gets. This is something that took me quite a long time to realize. The compliments flow down, like in an organization or in a hierarchy. Compliments flow down and criticism flows up. When you're the dad of a family, or you lead a team or a company or a country, it's your job to give compliments to the people that work for you. You've got to build them up. And that takes a lot of energy. And when you're working for somebody, you always see what's wrong and what they're doing wrong and so on. In fact, even when we watch sports on TV or at the arena, it's like, oh, what an idiot. Why didn't he do that and that, And these are the top guys in the world, right, playing there. And you've never played the sport, but oh, what an idiot. You know, I would have done this, I would have done that. It's really, really easy to criticize. So, but the tough thing is, when you're sitting at the top, the only thing you hear all the time is criticism. And sometimes it's more than criticism. It's like violent stuff that happens, really severe stuff, criminal stuff that happens. Threats and death threats and that kind of stuff. And you've got to keep on being positive and give compliments and help to build people up and have the vision. That is enormously difficult. It's very difficult. So to not take the criticism personally, you've got to have a spiritual practice where you distance yourself a little bit from that, but without closing off. It's easy to say, oh, they're all stupid, but that doesn't solve anything. Then you'll just end up making more mistakes. You've got to stay open to the feedback, but don't take it personally. That's the key. And meditation helps with that.
Any questions from you guys? Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can just, So I just wanted to come back to your relationship with regulators and decision makers. How do you perceive, say, the know-how gap between what you're currently building that's truly innovative and the fact that maybe decision makers and regulators have been trained the old-fashioned way? How do you perceive that, and how do you overcome that gap?
Yeah, that's actually been one of my success stories, is to persuade regulators that they should not focus on the technology. This is a constant thing. Every opportunity I have is, do not focus on the technology. Because the technology changes so quickly that if you make the regulations for a particular technology, the regulation will be out of date tomorrow. We should focus on general principles in law. In other words, don't do a rules-based approach. Use a principles-based approach. And to use an easy analogy, if you kill somebody, does it matter if you use a knife or poison, or whether you throttle them, strangle them? It doesn't matter. And you don't need to make a new law for every different way of killing somebody. Doesn't matter. You just make a law that says killing is wrong. And if you kill, we're going to punish you. End of story. Doesn't matter how you do it. And the same thing with technology regulation. It's a mistake for governments to regulate technology. What they should regulate is what you do with the technology. Because technology is neutral, which is another thing that I keep repeating to regulators. Technology is neutral. It's not good or bad. A knife is just a piece of metal. In a surgeon's hands, it saves lives. But in the hands of a murderer, it kills. The same knife. So if you look at the murderer, then the regulator would say, oh, you've got to ban a knife. But by banning the knife, you're also killing far more people that would have been saved by surgeons. So don't regulate the technology. Regulate the use of technology. And that way you have a technology-neutral regulation that is timeless. Now, that's in an ideal situation. You do need some understanding of technology to even help to formulate principles and so on. But that's the direction that we should push in. Because that way, you can have the innovation. Because there's freedom to innovate. You can develop all the technology you want. But when you use it in a bad way, then the law catches you.
One or two last questions.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think people in Switzerland need in order to become more resilient to failure and standing up again and fail and standing up? What do you think they need?
That's a very important question and a very complex question. There's a lot of different things. And probably the thing that will change them, that is the hardest to change, is just the culture. I mean, if you look at Europe, the French and the Swiss and the Germans and the English and the Italians, they've each got their own culture. And you can do what you want. That is unbelievably resistant to change, even across many centuries. So it's not realistic to think that that's going to change anytime soon. But you can change the incentive system. And one of the things that needs to be looked at is to make it a lot easier to start and run small businesses. Switzerland makes it really difficult. If you're a big company, it's fine. It's great. you've got great protection and so on, and they can pay a team of lawyers to do everything for you. But, and I don't want to complain about Switzerland. Switzerland has a lot of good things. That's why I came here, and I still think it's the best place in the world to do this. But for startups, it's very difficult. In New Zealand and Canada and the United States and England and scores of other countries, you can set up a company for $100 or $200 from your computer at home without leaving your desk within minutes or hours at the most. And then you're done. You set up your website and you're in business. Here, the cheapest company is a GmbH, and you've got to put down 20,000 francs. That's 100 times more. So if you don't have a rich uncle, I mean, that's one example. The labor law might be better than the EU, but it's still very bad compared to a lot of other countries like the United States and Hong Kong and Singapore. And those are the ones we're competing with because it's a global world. Labor laws needs to be made more flexible. The regulations relating to company law itself are very outdated. They kind of go back to the 19th century. That is just way behind. So there's a whole bunch of these things, and we are in discussion with the government about these, and they cannot do everything at the same time. But one of the things that we pushed for is, if they wanted to change the law here, it takes 3 years or 5 years if you're good, if you're successful. That's way too long. By that stage, Singapore has left us in the dust. So the thing that we've pushed for is make a new, like a sandbox, a special law for startups and up to a certain size. And then you can make that law fairly quickly, like within a matter of months. And then the other law continues. And then gradually you can expand this law to be open to more and more companies. And eventually everybody's in there. And nobody uses the old law anymore, and you just get rid of it. So that's one of the approaches. So if you do these things and make it easier for startups, then young Swiss people will be more incentivized to start startups.
Mm-hmm.
So continuing on this, you talked a lot about regulation. And if you could like snap your fingers and you have one regulation in place concerning all these cryptocurrencies, what would you say is the one most important thing that you would see Switzerland have?
That's a difficult question, but if I have to answer quickly, I would say Switzerland needs to recognize new forms of digital identity. And again, the government should not develop that technology for new identity. That would be a mistake. They already tried that. They tried that with Swiss ID, and it's a complete failure. Nobody uses it. They should allow private companies to develop innovative new forms of identity. And because that's really holding back crypto technologies, not just in Switzerland, but internationally, is that what we've got is an analogy to when email was developed. The post office tried to survive and people actually did this. They would take their letter, write it on paper like always, then take it to the post office scans it, and sends it by email to the other post office, and then somebody goes and collects it there and gets a printout. I mean, that's crazy. So that's trying to take a new technology and push it into an old technology. And that's what's happening because of identity. Old government identity regulations, where you need a passport and a driver license and so on. Because identity is the basis for the Know Your Customer regulations and anti-money laundering regulations. So identity is the key thing that's holding us back. Because one of the things that people say is, well, Bitcoin's great and this is great and that, all these new technologies, but the one thing that we haven't got right yet is the user interface, the user experience. That's what keeps it from being mainstream. Only the geeks use it because the user interface is bad. So we need to keep innovating. That's not the problem. That is the problem, but the problem is not that we don't know how to create a good user experience. We do know how to do that. I mean, with the iPhone and all these other apps, we know how to do that. The problem is that we are held back by the government identity regulations that require you to go through all the KYC and AML with passports and driver licenses and so on, and most of the world doesn't even have those things. And then you can't have a good user experience because of this stuff. But if we allow companies to innovate on the identity, and the government recognizes those innovative identities, then we can have a top-notch user experience. So that's where we need to go. And again, in line with the technology-neutral theme, what they should do is not say this or that technology is good or bad. They should say, set a standard and look at the false positive and false negative rate of passports and driver licenses, which are pretty bad. I mean, every teenager in the United States has a false driver license to get into the bar. So they should say, this is the current government standard, like this is the error rate. Any technology that is better than that is accepted. And then you'll have competition between different technology companies, and they'll just get way better than the government identity. And it'll keep innovating, and the user experience will go through the roof. And then we can make it mainstream.
So I think we have time for one last question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Hans Richard here. Johann, one question, a personal one. What is your why that keep you fighting the storm? And by the way, you have a brilliant memory, eh? Congratulations, I reckon.
Thank you. My why is helping to make society work better. And if I have to be totally selfish about it, in other words, why is that my why? What drives me personally is two things, joy and freedom, and they're kind of two sides of the same coin for me. And in fact, if you look at pictures of, if you do a search, image search, Google image search for joy, you'll see a physical pose that's like this. And if you do a Google image search for freedom, you'll see the same pose. So it's the same kind of emotion, different facets of it, but that's what drives me personally. I'm a free spirit, and I love freedom and joy. I think that's what drives actually probably most of us. And but to be able to live that way, to experience that joy and freedom, we need an environment that is free. And by free, I mean that people can deal with each other voluntarily to build things and build services and do things that help each other, that provide value to each other. And so that's what drives me, is to help create that environment through technology, through regulatory reform, or whatever.
So let's see if we can squeeze in one more question. Yes, over here.
Yeah, very quick one. What do you see future roadblocks in, crypto has reached a meaningful scale, has got wider spread recognition, but what do you see are the next kinks along the route, or what's the most important one you need to overcome now to get it to the next level?
So beyond the identity thing that I mentioned, which will require the cooperation of governments, and I think it only requires the cooperation of one significant government. Like if Switzerland did this, it would be like dominoes, and other governments would do it as well. So here's a real opportunity for Switzerland to do this. But beyond that, if you look at the technologies themselves, there's a lot of hype. And the hype, for example, around Bitcoin is that it's super cheap and fast and so on. Well, it's not really true. And in fact, there's a lot of huge Bitcoin fans and conferences that used to accept Bitcoin, and they no longer accept Bitcoin payments because it's too expensive and too slow. So yes, there's talk about things like the Lightning Network and so on, but so there's promising things out there, but they are still experimental. We don't know if they will work. Some people say yes, some people say no. But we need technologies that are fast and cheap and scalable. And that's what we're working on at Monetas, and there's also that's also what other people are working on.
So really the last question from John.
Thank you. I've been working with people for about 20 years, and we also do an entrepreneurs event every Tuesday morning. And one of the discussions coming up, and it's more of a self-help group, and one of the problems is, how do I survive? And I noticed at the very end of when you were talking, you said, and meditation, of course. And it would seem like, and of course, but I mean, Could you expand on that? Because I think that's really important on how we survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that question. So I grew up very religious, which is not surprising, coming from many generations of missionaries on both sides, mom's and dad's side. But as a young kid, I started having more and more questions about it. And in my teens, I had even more questions. And by the time I was 16, I realized this doesn't make sense to me, and I became an atheist. And having grown up with a very strict religion, like fundamentalist stuff where you're beaten and all those kind of stuff, pretty harsh stuff. So when you swing the other way, the pendulum swings quite far the other way. So I was kind of militantly atheist. And it took quite a long time for me to come more to the middle and a more balanced approach. So in that extreme phase, anything that sounded like spiritual and so on was to me just associated with the bad aspects of religion. So it took me too long to open to it. But where I am now, when I say spiritual, what I mean with that is not a supernatural being. I just mean a conscious approach to living. So developing one's consciousness, becoming more aware of what's going on inside, what goes on inside other people, and the impact that you have on yourself and other people, and trying to bring as much consciousness as you can to how you live. So that's what I mean by spiritual. Spirit in the sense of consciousness. So yeah, I came to it quite late. But the more I've gotten into it, and now I do have a regular practice of several times a day meditation, at least in the morning and the evening, and sometimes during the day at lunch as well. And I think the key is to not set too difficult a standard. If you're asking about how to get into it, we have this idea of the Dalai Lama sitting there and meditating for 6 hours, and you think, oh, I don't have time for that. I mean, similarly, if you think about going to the gym, you think, well, I've got to work out like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Nobody will do it. So we have to be modest. And by setting a low standard, it's much easier to do it. So my own standard is 1 minute. Just 1 minute. Anybody has a minute. Even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you work right through the night, you can have a minute just to sit still and breathe and practice meta-awareness, where you observe yourself. So you don't identify with what's going on with your thoughts and so on. So this is really a key thing, that meta approach. So one of the things that's difficult in living is when we identify with the wrong things. For example, if you're feeling depressed and you think, I am depressed, then that makes it very hard to get out of it. But if you just say, well, I have this feeling that's depressed, but that feeling isn't me. I can observe that feeling, and then it allows it to change. Or if you failed, you say, I am a failure, then you're not going to get out of it. But if you say, well, I did some things that didn't work out, but I can do some different things that might work out. So differentiating between the observer in yourself and practicing that observer perspective. That's just observing the feelings, the thoughts, the actions, the life patterns, but it's not identified with it. And doing that for 1 minute, and when you do it for 1 minute, you usually end up doing it for more than 1 minute.
Very, very insightful. Thank you. Thank you. Everyone that we... It's interesting, as I was just thinking about your first comment, your first reaction is that you meditate 3 times a day. It's like, oh, wow, that's something to strive for. It's like, wow. But then you say, well, actually, it's 1 minute. Oh, okay. You're one of us. Everyone can relate to that. And it's often you think it's so difficult, it's so challenging, but it's because we have such high expectations. But like you said, if you start off simple, you can always grow. So we're running over time a little bit, and also since we have to wrap up quite soon this evening, we don't want to stay too long here. We like to end every session with a series of what we call rapid fire questions. So we ask all our guests the same questions, and the first thing that comes to mind, you don't put a lot of thought into it. Just tell us what comes to mind.
Here we go.
So what is an item that you own that you would never sell?
My rain dancer. It's a sculpture that I have from South Africa, and it's of a woman who's standing back like this, the joy and freedom pose. But in her case, she's dancing to bring the rain down. There's a lot of drought in South Africa. It's a wonderful sculpture.
And what is your most unusual skill?
You mean something unexpected? I'm a certified massage therapist in California. When I was in California.
I guess the skills are still valid here, right? The certification maybe not, but the skills. What is more important, strength, speed, or stamina?
Stamina, unquestionably.
What historical figure do you most admire?
Wow, that's a great question. There's so many incredible people, but Aristotle probably. Unbelievable genius, and Archimedes as well, but Aristotle. Yeah.
What is your favorite season of the year?
Spring.
When was the last time that you tried something new?
Wow. When was the last time I did not try something new? You know, when you build something, you do that every single day. Yeah. In fact, one of my challenges is to not try to do too many things. I mean, Warren Buffett, another quote that I love, is he says the difference between successful people and very successful people is that very successful people say no to almost everything. They focus. And that's very difficult for me because I'm so curious and I like to do a lot of things and I like helping people. So I like to say yes. It's hard for me to say no.
Right.
Constant practice.
Team or single founder? As in a new company, startup, team or single founder? So co-founders or solo?
You mean what would I do?
What is your recommendation or your personal?
Definitely team.
Cats or dogs?
Say again?
Cats or dogs?
Whoa. I've had both growing up. That's very hard. Can you say both?
Sure.
Yeah.
Beer or wine?
Wine.
Your favorite app?
Oh. Google Maps.
What's one thing on your bucket list?
One thing on my bucket list is being out in nature for many months, like going down the Amazon River or going through the Sahara Desert or something like that.
And if you could choose the attribute of any animal, what would you choose?
The 9 lives or 100 lives of the cat family, like jaguars and cheetahs and so on. I have a painting that my mom did of a leopard that's in my apartment. It's beautiful.
Mm. That's very nice. It was very wonderful to have you tonight with us, Johann, and thank you so much for everything that you shared with us. And we continue to wish you all the best and success in your many endeavors.
Thank you very much.